Well, this is a continuation of the introduction to Egyptian culture. We'll even get a little bit to mythology this time, as much as there is mythology in Egypt. We're still reviewing what we have done and how it fits. We talked last time about how Hinduism or Hindu myths were the only live myths in the world that people still drew from, whereas Egypt was very dead. No one knows the language or the culture or anything anymore, and that the whole of the mythology was about death. We talked about a few other things. And we began with our topic of trying to understand consciousness so that we could understand hierarchies of consciousness or hierarchies of values. Now it turns out that the seers and the mystics of all cultures in all times, without even knowing each other, have all described the nature of the divine as a unity in Trinity, and that the triune attributes were only attributes because they were in a way almost indifferentiable from the one and had no existence other than as a materialistic symbol apart from unity, which is something that often happens. And we spent a long time looking at that whole idea of triangulation or threefold spiritual nature by looking at Brahma, Vishnu, and Shiv. The Hindus were quite abstract and elaborate in aiming for the ultimate Trinity, but they sort of collapsed it down just into three beings, and they didn't have a whole lot of hierarchy in between. The Hindus were also had this curious idea, if you remember, that the triune beings, in fact all gods, had female counterparts, and that the female counterparts were actually the ones who effected the action. This is a very strange notion to modern thinking, that everything was accomplished through the feminine in very, very ancient times. Now the Egyptians treated the same information in a different way. Almost all groupings or formations of gods or principles of divinity were divisible by three. Now you remember we went through a whole bunch of Egyptian terms last time, and one of the terms that we talked about that the Egyptians used, it was their term for cosmic root substance. They called cosmic root substance paut. But the same word had other meanings, in that cosmic root substance is continuous. Even though every kind of atomic differentiation takes place within cosmic root substance is itself non-atomic. It's continuous, and you might say ultimately contiguous or ultimately unified. It's inseparable. It's very much like the idea of mathematical space, in that there is no differentiation between one point and another. And points are even differentiations. Now, that idea of holding together or of the unification is basically what the word paut means. And the Egyptians had any formation or collection of gods was called a paut. And So they had all kinds of pouts, and almost all of the pouts were divisible by 3. And they were very Trinity-oriented in that each pout had an older male, an older female, and a younger male. The most famous of all of these pouts, 3 pouts you might call them, was the pair of Isis, Osiris, and Horus. Horus the younger. There was an elder Horus. We will probably talk about all the different Horuses or Horai or whatever they're called at some time or another. But so the very notion, if you remember when we were talking about Netter last time, that Netter represented the ultimate essence of divinity, a really divine quality. One of the things that Netter meant, or what divinity meant, was self-rejuvenating life. And this pervades very much the whole idea of a pout, that any threefold attribute of any divine principle or being was always creative. They took the idea of as above, so below, as we were talking about last time, almost to a maniacal end. Everything was as above, so below. Only with the Egyptians, it was the inverse more often, and they got themselves into a lot of trouble with that. They did so much with as below, so above, and you can get yourself into a lot of trouble because the material differentiations are much different than the unified parent source. But they felt that in the same way that a plant, as long as it lives, must grow. And as long as an animal lives, it must move. Especially they being in a very watery climate around the Nile, they saw a lot of fish and snakes and things like that who had to continue to grow, continue to move, to go on. And they carried this using the principle of so below as above. Therefore, there must be something that is essential to the nature of the divine. And what they concluded was that the divine must be creative. It's hard telling whether they concluded that or whether they saw that by a spiritual seership. So then, all 3 pouts, or elementary companies of gods, had that quality that there was a generation. And it was a generation that went on and on and on. The father and the mother gave birth or created the new son over again and again. And they did a lot with trying to align their consciousness with the different gods. And they did this through magical invocations and through magical drawings, and so that it wasn't so boring, they had many, many, many gods and many different stories about them, and each of these 3 pouts had a different kind of quality about it. It depended, as we remember we said last time, well, I think we're going to come to that a little bit again, the whole idea of gnomes in capital cities and such like that. But there were all of these triads of gods, and it's an interesting philosophy, and I don't know whether it was the product of the Egyptian consciousness or whether it was a product of the group spirit of Egypt or of the family or gnome spirits of Egypt that brought people to understand the idea of Trinity in unity by seeing so many different varieties of the same thing and hearing the stories of those different trinities, and especially doing the magical acts to gain favor, that by seeing triads from many points of view, different kinds of thesis, antithesis, and synthesis, and other triune principles, that eventually they understood all of the possible ways of trying abilities or trying consciousness, so that they came to the basic abstract idea of divinity itself. So most interesting way to go about things, by getting many, many different replications or many, many different forms of triune consciousness, and then from that understanding the whole principle of the trine. All right. Now, the three pouts, while they were very common, were usually collected into larger pouts. In fact, it depended on how wealthy the capital city of the nome was. And it depended on how wealthy the nome was, whether they could have a large pout of gods. Usually, but not always, the pouts were enneatic. They consisted of 9 members. And occasionally there were, like the famous pout, which we're going to talk about later on if we get a chance. We won't spend a lot of time on it. The pout of Heliopolis, which was one of the only 12 pouts, and it was the most dominant of any that ever became. Now, the Egyptians were as much obsessed with the number 9 as they were with the number 3. You keep finding it over again and again. They liked the threes, 3, 9, and 12. They had a recapitulation of the whole process of evolution every night, from when the sun sank until it came back up again. Those 12 hours were divided into a very, very elaborate underworld kind of activity. The underworld was called the Tuat, and Ra was taken through the Tuat and met the dead and met the various gods of the dead. And they even had dead gods, which are kind of unusual things, but they had unusual, very strange consciousness. But at any rate, a very unusual thing about the 9 pout, which was the ideal of many different gnomes, was to be able to support that many gods. One would expect that the 9 pout would have 6 males and 3 females, and that it would be composed of 3 pouts, but it doesn't work out that way. It turns out that there are usually 5 males and 4 females. And it was usually, they were broken into, we're going to get into something now that was very much borrowed by the Jewish people. It's what Kabbalists call the, well, it's kind of asymmetric there. It's what Kabbalists call the tree of life. And there was usually one patriarch divinity whose consciousness was carried through all of the pairs of males and females, and each pair of male and female gave birth usually to the next male and female, and they give, so that the whole idea of unity was never lost, because remember, this is an as above, so below society. The principle of unity, or the oneness of any being, carries through its entire pout, only it's reborn through successive pairs, and it holds the character of the whole pout in its nature. And so there is a pass along. It's a very vertical type of consciousness, which is the main reason that we're looking at Egyptian mythology as much as we're going to be looking at it, is because it is extremely hierarchical. In that regard, it's very much different than the mythology of the Hindus, which turned out to be chaotic and flat and not really hierarchical at all. So strangely, there was a triadic quality. Only it was the top of the let's see, what is that called? That's called the kether, isn't it, in Kabbalism? This is Binah, and this is Kether, I forget what this point is, and this point down here, when it gets connected to the earth, is the Malakuth. Have any of you studied the Kabbalah at all? I'm not really familiar with it. It's one of those things I've never been too much attracted to. It's a form of Rosicrucianism that has not come to me. But it's like saying then that one is carried through many unions and comes out the other end as an expression of itself. You can almost look at these as different planes of existence, and each of these planes of existence is sort of representing like a chain of the consciousness of the one being more and more differentiated. And as it becomes more and more differentiated, there are all these planes which in a way are parallel to each other, only each has a different quality, and each pair forms like a spectral whole that is a manifestation of the one. And that's the whole idea of a hierarchy in the first place, is so that the intent and the character and the creative activity of the one can come to its fullness by going through a metamorphosis wherein all of its qualities is given a full expression, and each level of that expression becomes a plane unto itself, which has its own laws and principles and experiences, and it allows for all kinds of creation and working out many ramifications on each level, while still at the same time it's carried out in the vertical sense. So the tree of life type of quality of the Enneatic, they didn't usually have this point on the bottom. They usually had 4 pairs and 1 at the top. So that this is again that obsession with great verticality, and the way it goes is that the one at the top dominates, and without having that one at the top, you would not have the vertical expression. If there were many struggling to be the top, and they were all about equal with each other, there would be no hierarchy. And without any hierarchy, there could not be a vertical delineation of all of the different qualities in a parallel fashion, and one would be incomplete. One would be, in a way, spiritually gutted. Okay.
I've seen the tree with
10. Yeah.
The bottom square there.
Yeah.
Take those 2 points and put those in the middle of the first 2 squares. And the bottom.
This, and put them here?
Yeah.
Oh, yes, okay. All right. Yeah, there are many ways that it can be done. This is the most common, though.
And the first 3, I think, are Kether, Bria, and Hakma.
Binah, I believe.
Binah.
Yeah. Yeah. All right. Now, all of the different pouts, whether they were 3 or 9 or 12, were strongly local. They were local to a given nome, and usually to the capital of that nome. And these nomes They're spelled Nome. These gnomes, even though all of the gods were known all over Egypt, the different pauts and the different leading gods and goddesses of different gnomes in capital cities were special to special places. And so most people didn't travel around much. They stayed in their gnome or they stayed in their capital city, and they specialized in the worship of the lead god at least, and in the gods of their gnome. So it was very, very orderly in that it was easy to maintain somebody under a consciousness of a group spirit, such that everybody was born and they had the flavor of that society and that worship. A group spirit is a higher spiritual intelligence that acts as a tutelary consciousness for the evolving beings under its power. And these group spirits or cultural spirits or race spirits or family spirits or clan spirits hold people together and bring them exactly the kind of experiences that they need. There is a specialization so that if you are in one gnome or if you're in one culture in ancient history, you got one kind of experience, and then you were incarnated in another kind of culture and got another kind of experience, because it was a time of separation and specialization. It takes a very advanced degree of consciousness to maintain a unity and hold it all together so that you can work with all of these things. Most people are weak, and in their weakness they need to specialize. The material world, by its very separative nature and the elements and qualities in the material world, is such that it requires some degree of specialization. Now, Egypt was divided into as many as 44 nomes, 44 regions, each with a capital city. This is very interesting to me because of the as above, so below quality. The Claudius Ptolemy, who was a Greek that was much influenced by the Egyptians, that Claudius Ptolemy is the father of modern astrology. And he was both an astronomer and an astrologer, and he had the famous map that was as above, so below, where all of the different stars in heaven were found in different places on the earth. So that if you took the celestial sphere and the terrestrial sphere and placed them right, that everything would be lined up. Of course, the Earth spins, so that makes it a little different. In fact, the entire map of Claudius Ptolemy, and in fact, you might say all of reality, is related to Egypt. Egypt is sort of the center of the Earth, strangely enough. This is an odd outlook. It's not Greenwich, as the English would have you believe. And it's not that name that I can't pronounce in India, that as they would have you believe. It's probably Egypt. The oldest and the most differentiable of all of the constellations is the Pleiades. And the ancient name for the Pleiades was Kema. And the ancient name for Egypt was Kemenu. We're going to come back to this in a little bit. And if you take the Pleiades and you put them right straight over Egypt, which happens sometimes in the precessional cycle, then the heart of the dragon, if you're looking up the north passage of the pyramid, In fact, if you're sitting in the Grand Gallery and you leave the plug in the pyramid and put a little water in there that acts as a mirror, when you sit in the Grand Gallery and look down, reflected off of that water, going right up the passage of the North Passage of the Great Pyramid, you would see a black rectangle, and right in the center of that rectangle would be Thuban, which is Alpha Draconis, which is or was the brightest star in Draco the Dragon. And that says a whole lot that I don't want to get into, but from this is where the ancient Egyptians made their maps. In fact, you know that all of the terrestrial land masses, if you take a line running north and south through the Great Pyramid and east and west through the Great Pyramid, it divides all of the land masses exactly into quarters. There's all sorts of other things like that. All of the names of the places in the world fit in exactly with its map and with constellations and all like that. And the whole idea was then that Egypt itself was a microcosm, so that even though there were supposedly 44 nomes, Ptolemy had 47 constellations. And I would be very likely to believe that there were at least 47 nomes at some times, even though the Egyptologists would pull out their hair at that assertion. And they would pull it out even more if I would go for 52, because that would fit in perfectly with the other Atlantean calendar, the calendar of the Aztecs, which was based on 52. They had 13-day weeks. It's based on a deck of cards, and they had 13-day weeks, and 4 of them came out to 52, and then a number of replications of 52 came out to be the whole cycle of the year, but that's something I didn't want to get into. It's all on the side. So one would expect that as above, so below, that the nomes were associated with different constellations, but that's a wild speculation, which is why I like it so much. I can't give that out as anything. The nomes themselves were very stable in size. The Egyptians were a very contented people. They had an extremely stable society. The only great variance was the when and how badly the Nile flooded and how much advantage they could take of the floodwaters of the Nile for growing their crops. And they weren't warring people, and even though they were extremely partisan about their gods, they didn't really fight with each other. They were not a warring society, and they were overcome by a number of people. The Persians and other people overcame them. Each of the nomes, which was very stable, had a capital city, and in that city was the temple to the god of that city and of that nome, and there is where the really partisan people were, the priests. And the priests of Egypt had enormous powers because they could control even more than Catholic priests, historical Catholic priests. They could control your life on the earth because they were the only thing like physicians. They had all the herbal remedies. They had quite sophisticated. They were capable of brain surgery, and they did things like that. They used very sharp clamshells and did brain surgery. And this is from academic science. It's not from far out science. And they also had control of what happened to you after you died. And they had power over the people, and they realized that if they could make the pout of their nome strong, its influence would come over other nomes, and they wouldn't try to obliterate the other nomes, but there would be some tribute that came to them, and in some cases, places like Heliopolis and Memphis and places like that, actually Thebes, those 3 cities actually at some time almost dominated all of Egypt. So the character of the city and pretty much of the nome was the character of the god. And the gods were said to actually dwell there. So I imagine that if you were clairvoyant, that you could see that. In fact, there are interesting things that seers such as Jeffrey Hodson describe, great spiritual beings in temple ceremonies and things like that radiate their character down to where a religious activity is taking place, and through that the people have their union with the divine through that particular divinity. This goes all the way back to Atlantis, and in Atlantis the people claimed that the gods walked among them. And as we said before, the reason that Egyptian culture is so very, very much older than any other culture that we're going to look at is because it had to do with the migrations out of Atlantis, and those memories were still very much in the consciousness of the people. And they had very mundane ideas of gods. They had gods that ate and drank and such like that. The chief god of any nome or capital city was almost always the center of a three-pout. And sometimes the pouts were larger if they could afford it. Usually, there were no central gods and goddesses for all of Egypt. It was very much by locale. There was one great exception, and that is the solar deity. The solar deity, or the central one, or the central light of everything, was pretty much a universal in strength throughout Egypt. Who that one was varies, and we're going to have a lot to say about that. If the deity rose or fell in popularity, and deities rose and fell sort of like stocks do on a market, and for the same reason. If a plague came along and that kind of plague was of such and such a god, and there was not a proper antidote for it, and many, many people died, the stock of that god went down, and that gnome and its pout went down with it. You know, the gnomes waxed and waned in strength. You know, at different places in the Nile, different kinds of floodings of the Nile made a difference as to whether different regions would be wealthy or not wealthy. And so that, to a large extent, cycles in climate, long and short-term cycles in climate, had a lot to do with the rise and fall of divinities. If you think about it, that sounds very correct, because various planetary consciousnesses change, become weaker or stronger in different planetary cycles versus others, as well as other cycles. And so one would expect that various gods would go up and down, and that those cycles would be tied right together with weather cycles and things like that. It's very, very difficult to tell then whether it was the above or the below that causes the waxing or waning of different divinities and their pouts. In the most ancient times, the ancient Horus was the sun god and was the first unified singular divinity throughout all of Egypt. At other times it was Osiris, at other times it was Amun, but throughout most of Egypt and most of the glory of historic Egypt, it was Ra. And we're going to spend a bit of time talking about Ra, probably a couple of talks, the next two most likely. The most powerful and generalized of all the pouts was the pout at Heliopolis. The way names Opolis is Greek for city, and they had the name of the god was the name of the city. And the Greeks, but the Egyptians did not have a history. All of their history was involved in the religious doctrine. They really didn't have a whole lot of mythology either, because that was all officially canonized in religious doctrine. And it was, it's again hard to tell whether the consciousness of the people made the religion or whether the religion made the consciousness of the people. Because all of their religious doctrine was in hieroglyphs etched in, chipped into stone. No wonder it was a very stable kind of religion, and no wonder it was a very dogmatic, unchanging kind of religion. In some cases, some of the most sacred things, there was not only was it engraved in stone, but then it was filled in with lapis lazuli, the tablets of the religion. That's pretty ritzy. This is on megalithic scale, doing jewelry kind of work. But they took a lot of time with that. But you can see where it's a really fixed, moribund kind of consciousness that we're dealing with. So Helios was the sun. Heliopolis, then. It was a city that in the Greek was pronounced Anu. And it was about 15 miles northeast of downtown Cairo, is where Heliopolis was located. That's where they theorized it was, and they dug down, and sure enough, that's where Heliopolis was located. And that was probably the most famous of all of the Egyptian civilizations. Now, like almost all of the ancients, because they probably had the same seership, the universe was broken into heaven, or many heavens, earth, and an underworld. And we'll come when we get to the Greeks. We'll have a lot to say about that. And there were gods for the heavens, there were gods for earth, and there were gods for the underworld. And the Egyptians literally saw gods walking among them, and were, I don't know if they were the lords of Venus and Mercury, but they were right among the people in the early times. Now, I don't know if you want to, I'll just mention them. The great, or the macrocosmic pout for heaven, we're going to go into it a bit later on, was Heliopolin. And it was composed of Tem, Shu, Tefnut, Seb, Nut, Osiris, Isis, Set, and Nephthys. And superimposed on all of these was Ra. Then, for earth, the earthly gods, which they were called the little part of gods, there are at least 11 there, and sometimes there are up to 15 or 17. There is Rat, Am Anu, Am Munchit, Am Het Sekret Ka Heptet, Am Nederhet, Am Hechpar, Am Sa, Am Tet, Am Het Ura, Am Unoreso, Am Uno Met. All right, you got all of that. And the mirror world, or the underworld, there was also a hierarchical pout for it, but that one is pretty much, they don't give the names of those divinities. They have.
Is this like a birthday cake, heaven on top of earth on top of...
That is the way one is given to see it with a materialistic consciousness. Truly, it has something to do with the spiritual consciousness, which is a very, very deep, deep thing. The underworld in the spiritual consciousness is something that I don't think I'm prepared to speak to right now. But the commonplace Egyptian saw heaven as the sky. even though they knew about spirits and doubles and etheric bodies and silver cords and all of that, it was part of their everyday language, they still saw it pretty much in the upward direction of sky. And the underworld were the antipodes, the part of the world that was dark. That when the sun went down, it went into the underworld. And it very complicated the regions of the underworld and the way they are built up in walls and embankments and things like that. We won't have time to go into it, but they have some things that I couldn't decipher in dozens and dozens of years about all of the activities that take place. There are serpents with wings and human legs and heads coming out of their backs and things like that. And there are all different kinds of divinities, and there are as many malevolent divinities as there are beneficent ones. And there are pits where the souls of blasphemous, irreverent people are burned in fire. It was way before, thousands of years before Dante. So this is really stuff. It's been around a long time. The function of the gods of the microcosm is not very much discussed. They were pretty prosaic. They probably walked around eating honey cakes like everybody else, but still they were magical and divine, and they were capable of dying, which is, I don't know if I want to go into that. All right. We're still introducing, and we're now starting to get a little bit into something like mythology and maybe even a few spiritual ideas. We're going to look at an unusual pout. Egypt was divided into two halves. The Upper Egypt, which was the southern part of Egypt, where Dendera and places like that are, and Lower Egypt, which is the northern half. It's hard telling which dominated. It seems like earlier in history, Upper Egypt was more dominant, and later in history, Lower Egypt was more dominant. But there was sort of like a reflection of them, and the nomes were almost divided equally between the northern and southern half. And we're going to look at the pout of the city of Kemenu. And the city of Kemenu is probably the most famous in our vocabulary, because this was so representative of what the Greeks thought Egypt was that they even called Egypt Chemis. They shortened it to something like that, which is where our word chemistry comes from and where our word alchemy comes from. And it was their name for the Pleiades. The city of Chemis was in it was in Upper Egypt. Kemenu, yes, and it was in the nome of Un. If you like, I'll try reading some Egyptian later on, just phonetically for the fun of it. And the animal each nome had its own animal, and the animal for Un was a rabbit, and it was a hieroglyph of a rabbit and it was sitting on a funky kind of pedestal or something like that. And the god of Kemenu, was Tehuti, which we know as Thoth. And Thoth was the equivalent for Hermes to the Greeks. And so the city of Kemenu was known to the Greeks as Hermopolis. And that's what we want to look at, basically, because it really fascinated me. Most capitals and nomes had small pouts. But Kamenu was famous for a number of reasons. Because they were able to maintain a large pout. Only it was also famous because it was an 8-pout. And it is a very unusual 8-pout in that all of the members of it were male and female, husband and wife, brother and sister. And they were polar reflections of each other. There was a great deal of equality in this. Thoth, even though Thoth was abstractly put in as the head of the pout of Hermopolis or of Kamenu, Thoth wasn't there from the beginning. It was known as an 8-pout from the beginning. And the pout of Hermopolis is very old. Very old. I don't even know if I can touch on all of that. But it was the oldest pout in several ways. It was old in that it goes very far back into history, but all of the gods and goddesses of the pout of Kamenu were themselves very ancient. They were primeval. They were there from the beginning, and they were, so to speak, the source of the beginning. So that's where we're going to be looking for the next few minutes. This is the pout of pout. This is the company of gods from cosmic root substance. And this very homogeneous group of gods begins with Nu and Nut. In general, adding the T onto any word makes it feminine. Now this has to do with a creative activity. How to say this? Nu literally means God of watery space. And the space is not only watery, but it's inert. Meaning to say that even a gel would seem thin compared to the inert watery space of Nu and Nut. They're both polarizations of the same thing. Nut is the primordial mother of space. And the state of Nu and Nut, it is fluidic, it isn't solid crystalline, but it's so thick fluidically that it's totally inert. And it is sometimes called the sky or abyss of water, so that there is it's a very almost inhospitable place, the abyss of like falling into an extremely turgid kind of spiritual quality. Nu is in human form. We're going to talk about some of these things when we have a little more time. We don't tonight. In human form, but is often pictured with a frog head and sometimes with a snake head. The whole idea of Nu as the god of watery space is Nu and Nun or Nen are very close to each other, and there's a pun in there. Again, just like the Hindus, the scribes of the deepest mysteries of the Egyptians loved to pun, because it was a way of understanding subtle differentiations, and it was really a joyous kind of experience. The quality, almost all of the pout of Hermopolis, males and females, are pictured almost the same. It's very hard to differentiate them from each other. All of the males are usually either frog-headed or snake-headed, because this has to do with an inert state. And the people of Egypt, where there are crocodiles, but most commonly where you see frogs and snakes will both hibernate and estivate. And when you have that quality of something being in a dead-like state that is capable of coming back to life, is why the symbol of these divinities was with those animals, because you can take a snake and put it to sleep, and you can make it almost as stiff as a board, and then it warms up and it comes back to life. The same thing is true with the frog and even a crocodile. Crocodiles in Africa will estivate in the hot seasons. The crocodiles that are landlocked in ponds, they'll dive under the mud and they'll fall asleep, and then the whole pond will just dry up. And then when it rains again, the pond fills up, then the crocodile comes back to life. So all of these have the same thing. Nut, on the other hand, has an emblem. I have a three-dimensional picture of one. The emblem of a uraeus with a globe. And this is something like the emblem of Nut. Only this is three-dimensional, and the emblem of Nut would have been a golden solar sphere. And you see a lot of those, and usually in the hieroglyph, they have the tail of the serpent sticking up into the air. Okay, it's again the whole idea here. The uraeus with the globe is a hatching idea, because we're dealing here with the creative myth of the Egyptians, and we're dealing with the oldest quality of humans. Sometimes Nut was cat-headed, usually with a uraeus and disc. And the cat was most associated with females, and it was considered an activator. In fact, the cat was considered very, very divine in Egypt. And in the same way that the serpent was the hatcher of the cosmic egg, the cat was the activator of the energy that lived inside of that egg. And the serpent wound back on itself, and that's why it's in that sort of thing surrounding the egg. The next pair is He, or sometimes it's called Hehu, and Hehut, or Hehut. There's somebody in town here that speaks ancient Egyptian. I don't know how they ever got the pronunciations. Hehu and Hehut represent the first differentiations of time, in the same way that Nu and Nut represent space, Hehu represents the differentiations of time. He is the Egyptian word for either infinity or eternity, an unlimited number. And sometimes it is this pair was associated with warmth, and sometimes they are associated with atmospheric movement. And they were considered the supporter of life. That is, they were considered the supporter of the scarab, and the scarab was the supporter of the solar ball. Well, we're going to come to all of that later on. And again, Hehu, or Hehu, was sometimes pictured as a man with a frog's head and sometimes with a snake's head. Hehut was considered the sharer of support, and there was something about that when there was a realization of time as different from space, because the space was inert, and when there was a time, there was more of a differentiation, and the delineation of that differentiation of consciousness was represented by the Egyptians as a support. That is, eternity was supported by the consciousness of Hehu and Hehut, which is a most unusual idea, but it's very exciting to think of the idea that the divinities that represent time are what support the manifestation of a cosmos altogether. That if you just had the inert mass of space, there would be no differentiation. But when you have the differentiation of time, there is a consciousness there, and that supports creativity. So temporal awareness leads to or manifests in a support of differentiation in the cosmos. Now, the next pair is Kikui and Kikuit. And this is the differentiation of darkness, which means to say that with the recognition of time, there is a beginning of awareness of the potential of waking consciousness, which is associated with light. But if the light wasn't light yet and the consciousness was only waking, then it would mean that this was the creation of darkness. Very, very clever creation, because once you have created the darkness, you have created the potential for a light to come out of. Kikui is called the grandfather, and Kikuit is the grandmother. And it is the primordial darkness that covers the watery abyss, or that is deposited by the watery abyss. So you can see that these are some rather subtle distinctions that they're making here. The Kikui represents the darkness before dawn. Kikuit represents the darkness after dusk. So relative to time, which at this point still had to be circular or spherical and really undifferentiated, it was only beginning to support itself. Dusk and dawn are the same thing, which means that we're near to light now, either light that is going out or light that is coming on. So you could say then Kekuit is vespertine and Kekui is matutine, if you like the the Roman terms for it. And it says that light is coming. I don't know how to describe the Egyptian consciousness, but the Egyptians were well enough to do that there was no poverty. And so they had some leisure time. But they didn't have television. And they did have nature. And since all of their religion was singularly, vertically focused on the one, which was represented by the sun, they were exceedingly light-sensitive people. And they had the cycle of each day and the cycle of each day within each season and within each year. As the light changed, that very subtle change in light represented some stage of spiritual consciousness in the eternal battle of light and darkness. So that the whole process of creation, where new light is thrown into the darkness and spirit proceeds into matter and expresses itself, and from that expression gains new experiences, new soul matter, and then withdraws back into itself. That whole cycle was like the sun passing into the underworld and coming back out. It's easy to see how the Platonists, who we talked about a couple of years ago, how the Platonists got their ideas so extensively from Egypt that they thought that this was the deathly world and that the spiritual worlds were the lively ones and that our body was our sarcophagus. It's easy to see how they came to that. So we have the grandfather and the grandmother, who are, again, the grandfather is usually a frog or a combination frog and beetle, meaning to say that there's life and light beginning. And the vespertine Kekuit had either a frog or a serpent head. And the final pair were Ker and Kerhet. Oops, I got this. Geez. And Kerhet. Almost nothing is known about Ker and Kerhet. It represents the power or the energy that is in night. And these are the male and female power and energy that are in night. All right, we're going to come back to this all in just a little bit. But I want to mention something about this whole thing. Even though Thoth was given the spot up here, Thoth was never really there. That was something that was added later. Out of these two is where Ra is born. And that means that the whole focus of the Paut, Ra wasn't part of the Paut, but he represents the beginning of the newer Paut below it, or later in time. So that these represent all of the stages of pre-manifestation. They represent the stages of chaos, or they represent the stages of incubation in our own subconscious existence when we start doing things, or in our own superconscious existence when we start doing creative activity. As above, so below, these represent the different stages of that kind of activity. Each pair passed on all of its qualities. In this pout, more than any other pout, each pair passed its qualities on to the rest, so that the whole pout is collectively known as new. So that this primal pre-manifest or this pre-external existence, these are all states of new. So that the ancestor carries through all of the descendants and carries into the existence of things. So we're talking here about a stage of dreaming. We're talking about an elemental stage of things before there can be an existence. So we're talking then about chaos. And it's chaos that is not too dissimilar from the materialistic way that science describes the state of the cosmos before the Big Bang, that it was all jammed together in one place, that it was thick. Now, it's really interesting that even though there is no one at the head of the pout, this is very common to Egyptian, Judaism, and Gnostic groupings, or those people, tended to have this invisible triangle, and there was an implied one that was behind it. Like the Gnostics, for example, always have at the very top triangle, they have it open, and at most they have a flame there. So we're talking about 4 states, or we're talking actually about the 5th. And that 5th represents a supreme being. A supreme being that is so undifferentiated that it pre-exists before any manifestation in cosmic root substance. And the invisibility is the connection with the unknown, unspeakable absolute, which is why the triangle is hidden. And what this, in effect, is saying in spiritual language is that the ever-invisible, which must always remain invisible, the character of that carries through even all of the pre-manifest states of existence. What this means is that the ultimate truth, the ultimate of our own being, but especially the ultimate being of the whole business, must always be invisible. So we're talking about then that the deepest of the 5 globes or the 5 states of chaotic existence is invisible, and for that reason ultimately powerful and ultimately subtle and ultimately influential in all creativity. That's an idea that it's really shocking how monistic peoples or monotheistic people who were so focused, so to speak, on the disk of the sun could recognize that the sun, as dramatically powerful as it was only a symbol for something that went way beyond it, that was invisible in a way that the sun itself was completely visible. Ra, when Ra speaks as Nut. But Nut is the Nu or Nut. Nu is that first word that issues from the absolutely powerful silence. So Ra says, I am Nu. But he doesn't, from that, Beyond that, there is the implied state that there is something that is ever invisible. Oh boy. So when Ra says that, it's very much like Christ saying, to know me is to know the Father. And in this case, Ra claims to be and is regarded that way even by Nu as the Son who is greater than the Father, meaning to say that the new manifestation and the new one that is going to be after the works of Ra are done is greater than what it was before there was a manifestation. So whether to be or not to be always turns out to be fruitful, and that is already in the original impetus. All right. This makes pretty good source material. It is by a very materialistic man that doesn't understand much at all about spirituality. He was a great Egyptologist. His name is E.A. Wallace Fudge. This is a 2-volume work. It's something like well over 1,000 pages, the whole business. And we're going to look into the 2 creation stories of what happens or what issues from the pout of Hermopolis, with all kinds of commentaries, probably more than anybody will want, especially me. Now, the interesting thing is that there are 2 versions of the creation story, the creation of Ra. And when Ra is created, everything else is created. And this is really neat. It's given in hieroglyphics, and it's given in phonetic Egyptian, and it's given in English language with alternatives. So let me try reading it in phonetic Egyptian. Shet enti rech kepero nu Ra. Seker epep techetu neberchur chetfuf. Em kepfruf. Nek pu kepfer. Em kepra kepferna kepfer kepru. You see what I mean? It would be a little bit difficult. All right. We'll go through. I'll read through the 2 creation versions first, and then I'll go with commentary until somebody shoots me. All right. This is version A. The book of knowing the evolutions of Ra and of the overthrowing Apep. Apep is darkness. The words of Neberchur, which he spake after he had come into being, which is another name. Neberchur is another name for Ra. I am he who came into being in the form of Kepra, which is the rising sun. I was, or became, the creator of what came into being, the creator of what came into being, all after my coming into being. Many were the things which came into being, coming forth from my mouth. Not existed heaven, not existed earth, not had been created the things of the earth and creeping things in that place. I raised them from out of Nu, from a state of inactivity. Not found I a place I could stand wherein. I worked a charm upon or with my heart. I laid a foundation in Ma, which is order, something like karma, and I made every attribute. I was alone, for not had I spit in the form of Shu, not had I emitted Tefnut, not existed another who worked with me. I made a foundation in my heart, my own, or by means of my own will in my heart, and there came into being the multitudes of things which came into being, of the multitudes of the things which came into being, from out of the things which came into being, of births from out of the things which came into being, of their births. I, even I, had union with my clenched hand. I joined myself in an embrace with my shadow. I poured seed into my mouth. My own I sent forth issue in the form of Shu. I sent forth moisture in the form of Tefnut. Saith my father Nu, they make to be weak my eye behind. They make to be weak my eye behind them, because for double henty periods they proceeded from me, and after I became from God, one God's three, that is, from out of myself, and after I came into being in this earth, were raised up, therefore, Shu and Tefnut in the inert watery mass wherein they were. Interesting, beautiful stuff, isn't it? Brought they to me my eye in their train. After, therefore, I had united my members, I wept over them, and came into being, men and women, from the tears which came forth from my eye. And it raged against me, and after it came and found that I had made another in its place, I endowed it with the power which I had made. Having made to approach, therefore, its place in my faiths afterwards, therefore it ruleth the earth to this whole extent. He's talking about the sun creating the moon and the moon being a rival to it. We'll go into this a little bit or a lot in a little while. I'm putting people to sleep already, though. The seasons fall into their movements or moments upon their plants. I endowed it with that which it hath taken possession of in it. I came forth from, or in the form of the plants, creeping things all, things which came into being all, in them gave birth Shu and Tefnut, Seb and Nut, gave birth Seb and Nut to Osiris, Horus Kent Anmati, Set, Isis, Nephthys from the womb, one after the other of them. They gave birth and they multiply in this earth. That's version 1. All right, this is version 2. The book of knowing they're very similar to each other, but there are some important distinctions. The book of knowing the evolutions of Ra and of the overthrowing of Apep. The words of Nebuchadnezzar, he says, I was or became the creator of what came into being. I came into being in the forms of Khepera, coming into being in primeval time. I came into being in the forms of Khepera. I was or became the creator of what came into being. That is to say, I produced myself from the primeval matter which I made. I produced myself from the primeval matter. My name is Osiris, the primeval matter of primeval matter. I have done my will in all of this earth, and I have spread abroad in it. I raised up my hand. I was alone. They were not born. Not had I spit in the form of Shu, not had I emitted Tefnut. I brought into my mouth my own name, that is to say, a word of power. And I, even I, came into being in the form of things which came into being, and I came into being in the forms of Khepera. I came into being from primeval matter, coming into being in multitudes of forms from the beginning. Not existed created things in this land. I made whatsoever was made, everything. I was alone. Not existed any other who worked with me in that place. I made what I made by means of divine soul. That which I raised up therein out of Nu, from the state of inertness, not found I a place whereon I could stand. I worked with the spirit which was in my heart. I laid a foundation before me. I made whatsoever was made, everything. I was alone. I laid a foundation in my heart. I made other things which came into being, and manifold were the things which came into being of Koepsel. They came into being what they gave birth to out of creations of their offspring. I, even I, spat in the form of Shu and emitted Tefnut, and I became from God one, gods three. That is to say, from myself, two gods came into being on this earth. Were raised up, therefore, Shu and Tefnut in Nu, wherein they were. Behold, my eye brought to me, they in the train of a Henti period. They proceeded from me, I collected my members, they came forth from myself after I had union with my clenched hand. Came to me my heart, or my will, out of my hand. The seed which fell into my mouth, I spat in the form of Shu, I emitted water in the form of Tefnut. I became from one God, gods three. That is to say, from myself, two gods came to being on this earth. Were raised up, therefore, Shu and Tefnut from out of Nu, wherein they were. A lot of repetitions. They really loved it in the ancient days. Saith my father Nu, they cover up my eye after them with bushes twice for hen periods. Vegetation and reptiles came from the god Rem, from the tears falling from me. Cried my eye, came into being mankind. I endowed it with power. It raged at me after it came, finding another growth within its place. Fell its vigorous power upon the bushes which I placed there to make adornment in it. Ruling therefore on its seat in my face, it ruled the whole world, gave birth to Shu and Tefnut, to Nut, Osiris, Heru, Kent, Anmati, Set, Isis, Nephthys, and behold their children, they create beings manifold in earth. This from the beings of children, from the beings of their children, they evoke my name, they overthrow their enemies, they create words of power for the overthrow of Apep, who is bound by the two hands of Aker. Not maybe his two hands, not maybe his 2 feet. May he be chained to one place, even as inflicteth Ra his blows decreed for him. He is overthrown on his back, wicked. Slit is his face for what he hath done. He remaineth upon his back, evil. That's the way they treated darkness. Apepi was the manifestation of darkness, but it doesn't say what it had done, other than to put out the light, which I guess is significant enough. The whole of the creation was a struggle of light to manifest over darkness. Very clearly, their conception, I'll try to give what I think are reasonable commentaries. I'm going to breeze through a lot of very heavy material really fast, because otherwise we'll be here all night. We don't want to do that. I don't want to do that. Clearly, it is metamorphic. It is evolutionary. That the whole concept of their creation has a rolling, repetitive, over and over again type of quality about it. Ra doesn't even say what those multitudes of things that came into being from things that came into being from things that came into being. He doesn't even say what they are. The mysteries would say that they are divine powers or creative beings or principles of nature that are intelligent expressions of the divine. They fall out in a logic or a creative logic out of the consciousness of the divine. and that they're metaphoric in that one evolves into another, and each creates from itself. So that when we are in the depth of our meditation, or when we are in the depths of our creative work, we have that same quality. It isn't a logic that just deduces that this follows this, follows this, follows this. This is a logic that proceeds forward. It deduces the future. It deduces or it remembers the future just like some people deduce or remember the past. So clearly, the whole idea of progress and of revolutionary, evolutionary, rolling kind of progress is in the consciousness of the Egyptians. So even though things may be chipped into stone, and even though they may be a very unchanging society, the roots of their whole creative consciousness, when things are brought out of the inert state of cosmic root substance, is a very lively, rolling quality. And it is an expression of sound power. In both versions, it is the product of a word, and it comes out of a mouth of a being that has no limbs, even though there are figurative limbs in the activity. It is, you might say, a poetry, a rolling poetic creation that, everything follows. And it's interesting to see that the things that are placed in there, it's very much like reading a taxonomical chart. If you follow an evolution that this thing was marked in the Jurassic period and this was, that if you look at while you're reading through this, I really recommend getting copies of it and reading it because it's a really lovely creative formula. But you can see that the different things that are created are time markers. It's almost as though the creeping things represent objective states, like this much has been attained, and this much has been attained, and so down the line. It's also very clear that even though it is a product of a word, and even though it is very logical, it is in no wise separated to the head. All of the power comes from the heart. All of the power of creation in Egypt cosmogony comes from the heart. It is as if to say the head, the heart, and the mouth are one thing. So that what we think and what we feel as a power in ourselves, it's clear that the author of this writes that the greatest power comes from an activity that is a foundation or a throne that is set in the heart, so that there is a power of feeling or a power of desire to create, and that the logic and the word that is spoken proceeds from it. It's very repetitive, as everything in creation is repetitive. Unfortunately, I'm not a good reader in that I can barely read the words, but if this were read to Egyptians by their priest who was very spiritual, it would be utterly captivating. So that all of those repetitions would be carrying you almost like you're carried by hearing the surf coming in. Like the repetitions are not dead things. It's not the same old stuff over again, day after day after day. It's each day is a brand new day, and each revolution of something new coming out of something new, that each wave has its own pearls of light in the beads of water that shine and come out of it, and it's like it repeats, and it's never the same kind of thing. Then there is the problem that the Hindus dealt with much different than the Egyptians. The Hindus dealt with the problem of primal creation, as you will recall, by having Brahma in an incestuous relationship with his daughter, who was also his sister, and in a way almost his mother. And that the whole creation is a consequence of incest. Now we come to the Egyptians, and that was unpalatable to the Egyptians, because you can see, from an Egyptian's point of view, that's like saying Brahma's desire for his creation was such that he couldn't hold himself or contain himself, such that he had to copulate with his own creation, with his own younger half that came out of him. That, even though the Egyptians were supposed to be, or maybe even were, more materialistic than the Hindus, that was unpalatable to the mystics of Egypt. So they said the whole thing came about as a result of masturbation. Both creation stories have to do then with everything coming into existence, or all of the gods coming into existence, or the first two gods coming into existence, and from them the rest of the Paut, and from them all of the creatures, especially in the second creation story. It's clearly a matter that this is a singular activity. Even though Ra unites with his shadow, with his second self, in another way, it is still an act of masturbation. Now, in the same way, I don't even know how to say it. It's even in some ways more gross than incest. Because with the incest notion, there was at least an externalization of self that didn't seem like self, and it wasn't so narcissistic. When you want to take the deepest of spiritual things and give voice to them in terms of human understanding, that's a really, really hard thing to do. But at least the notion of masturbation has it be voluntary. Now, I'm not at all saying that masturbation is a good thing or anything like that. I'm just speaking as a mystic commenting on creative activity and the way it has been expressed. It was voluntary, and it shows a union within one being. And he swallows his own seed. So like there is this whole idea of revolving eternity. And what are in human beings divided creative areas in the genitals and in the voice box and brain, that in the case of Ra Kepra, they are united in a cyclical way. And I think that's a really good way to deal with the issue, because it shows a divided self, and it shows a divided... I just didn't want to have 3 parts of introduction to Egyptian culture. But it does a really good job of showing the singular internal spiritual self-differentiation of consciousness, where above all, again, for the Egyptians, the unity is maintained even in the primordial creative act that differentiates. It's made really clear that when Ra, having no place to stand and coming from nowhere, as an act of will, spins himself out of Nu, out of the pout here of Hermopolis. He spins himself because nobody else does it. He is the alone begotten. He is the one that comes out of himself, and when he replicates himself, he does that also, cycling within an internal division of himself between genitals and mouth, and an internal division of himself between a kind of second self in a soul-spirit consciousness. There is the same kind of polarization in doubling that we have seen in all of the other creative myths that we've looked at over the past few years. It's really interesting how immediate it is that the unity, he doesn't even say why he did it. He says it was voluntary, and that, I guess, is enough. Even the coming into being is voluntary, and throughout the whole business, there's this whole idea that darkness must be overcome, that all of those things that are in the potential, all of those things we dream we would like to do, must eventually be done. And the more that we alibi and don't do them, the more we really should be urged to do them, because our creative activity is no different than the creative activity of Ra. We must have that same kind of urgency and that same kind of will to go on with creation and do it. I don't know how to say it in any other way. There's plenty of darkness I know in myself. But it's a very immediate kind of thing. The polarization continues even in the creation. What he spits out of his mouth becomes shu, and what he urinates becomes tefnut. And that which goes down then is the feminine. Tefnut is feminine because it ends with the T. And the shu is an upward. And when there is that polarization and that division of himself, then he knows himself. And it's really interesting that the eye of Ra, that the light or the central self-knowing, can't come into being until there is the not-self. The Buddhists would love it for the negatives, but until there is a polarization, which is a continuous, endless division of self into states of being that are not himself, only then is the I born. And it isn't until the three are born that the Son and the one, it's like everything we've been saying all along. He states it here in one sentence and says that, that there is a law that until one develops all three qualities of Trinity, that until then there can be no self-consciousness, there can be no manifest light for everything to be born. And it's really interesting, it's born out of this inert mass of water, because Nu is the inert water of the abyss. And remember when we were talking about one of the creative myths of, I think it was one of the ones of Vishnu, or was it one of the ones of Shiva? That all three of them floated to surface in the ocean. There had been a period where there was nothing, and suddenly into the ocean, Brahma, Vishnu, and Shiva rose to the surface, and they began a new creation, identical to what the Egyptians are saying, except that it isn't an ocean that you rise from the bottom up. It's like you rise from the top down, from the abyss. More, it's just weeping in both versions of the creation story. Human beings are born out of the tears of Ra. It doesn't say whether they are tears of sacrifice, or tears of loneliness, or tears of joy. It's really interesting that when they talk about humans being born, in one version they use the word men and women, and in the other version they use mankind. They never use the sexual differentiation, which like they were modern a long time ago, tens of thousands of years ago. But it isn't clear out of the precipitation, well, I don't know how to talk about it. I don't want to go into too much esoteric cosmology, but out of a repeated precipitation of water, like there was fire, first there was darkness, and there was fire, and then there was water, and out of the precipitation of water, humankind came. And humankind were selves like you and I. And I don't know how to say it any other way, but I have a notion that it's probably tears that are tears of sacrifice as well as tears of joy and tears of loneliness. I think that there is another kind of crying that isn't a result of one particular emotion, but of all emotions put together. You know what I mean? That sometimes everything feels so good, even the terrible things that are going on, that you just cry, just in the recognition of it all. And I think in that is where differentiation comes from. All right, the moon is born at about the same time. This goes back to Lemuria, which is a repetition of that ancient moon period in the mystic cosmology. In the moon period where the waters were divided from the waters according to the Bible story, is when the threefold spirit was given to humans even though it wasn't wakened up. And then in Lemuria, in this period, the earth period of creation, there was a recapitulation of that, and at the same time that the moon was created and the second self was created, the division and spiritual struggle as well as the struggle with evil in an external sense between the sun and the moon, one being the crystallizer, one being the vitalizer. It's very interesting to note that in both versions of the creation story, the self and the second self are born with humans, and they're both born with the struggle with evil and the struggle with evil and love or life, or the struggle of darkness or the orb of darkness versus the orb of light. So all of those things are present at the same time. Interesting to note then that the moon, or the creation of the moon, is another time marker. Now in the first creation story, now this is what leads me to believe that the Hebrews borrowed greatly from the Egyptians, because if you note in the first creation story, here, the first version, it was humans that were created first. Animals last. Humans first. So this is an evolution of life. And then later on the animals were born about the times of the seasons and things like that. All right, I have a whole bunch of other things there I want to skip, and I want to talk a little bit now of some commentary on the second version. It's clear that there was sectarianism, because in one it's Ra all the way through, and in the other it is Osiris. And it's very interesting to note that in the Osiris second version, the language is much simpler and far more clear. It's easier to read, but it's also much more mundane. But in the second version, humans are created last. So the second version is the version of form, and it is very true that Osiris, as god of the underworld, Osiris was a human-like god. In fact, Osiris even died, whereas Ra was a god of perpetual life, so that there is a polarization here in those who look at things from the viewpoint of light and life and spirit in the first creation story versus those who look at things in terms of form and death and matter and such like that. So the firstborn, the second story also makes a great deal about the name of the word. The first one, it was just a word of power. In the second creation, it has much more to do with the name. And the name, again, is much more personal. It's a much more formalized kind of thing. And we can see then that we can look at the same truth as from two different points of view. one being much more formal, much more personal, the other being much more of the spirit and much more lively. Again, first came the name born or the word born, and then came the seed born. And the seed very clearly is at the other end of the things issuing not from the voice, but things issuing from the other center of the creative energy. And in this, the seed falls. It isn't put into the mouth. In the second version, the seed falls into the mouth. And the mouth is then something like a creative vagina as well as a mouth, and that the second version shows like an attractive propensity that has things drawn or falling into it. And that this is again a very form-oriented thing. It isn't the quality of I by this fiat, this word of creative demand or power, bring everything into existence, but that there is something in here that I also draw things into me and then issue them out, that there is a cyclical type of quality, and the second places much more emphasis on that. This also leads me to believe that even though he carried it to very great extreme and didn't know what he was dealing with, and he carried it to materialistic extreme, the whole idea of oral versus vaginal versus anal kind of expression that Freud was dealing with is based on some very, very deep spiritual principles if they could be taken in a different light. What kind of creation we do and from what source is very important. The second version has also a greater emphasis on the aloneness, which is precisely what we would expect. When people live in a world of forms, those forms are isolated and separated from each other, and there is greater loneliness. Whereas in the first form, first creative story, it's much more spiritual and it's much closer to each other. There's much more intimacy. And then the second one shows more clearly, though, the foundation. It places a foundation in the heart, meaning to say that before we can do anything, whether it is a creative command or whether it is the recycling, as in the case of the seed falling into the mouth, I think even though Ra or Ra Kepra did not have a place to stand, there was a foundation in the heart. And I can't think of a better practical principle than that if one seats one's consciousness in the heart and depends on no other, on no thing else than the feelings, the creative will, the creative love, the desire to have things become, that if one founds oneself or rests oneself in the heart, there is no better foundation. This gets away from the whole idea of creative balance and how can a creation be sustained by a divine being that is as perfect as the creation that we live in, where there are these stupendous, imponderable powers, but at the same time such rare kinds of delicacy that can coexist side by side, that can only be done when there is a balance inside of the heart type of consciousness. I think reading these kinds of poems or these kinds of, this is actually a ritual, is a very healthy thing to do. Boy, I'm going to skip a lot of things here. Why don't I skip most of everything else? Otherwise, because there are too many things that I'd have to start all over again. Now, it's really interesting that Shu and Tefnut, when they come into being as the two poles, one by spitting and one by emanation of water, when they come into being, the I can first come into being. That until there is the threefold separation, there cannot be a self-conscious awareness of oneness. Now, that's a very practical thing, and I don't know how to put it in practical terms. In any endeavor that we do in daily life, if we balance the will to sustain with the feeling wisdom of understanding and the action of actually doing it, of executing it, which means killing it as well as making it be, the execution, that the sooner that we center ourselves in such a way that every act is an act of will, an act of wisdom, and an act, the sooner we can be self-conscious and the sooner we can open up to seership. I think I've mentioned it in the past that I worked in a dairy one time with a man that had this great intuition. And he had that great intuition because he had that balance. He didn't try to accomplish everything by will. He didn't try to accomplish everything by thinking his way through it. He didn't try to accomplish everything by sensitivity or action. But he balanced all three of those. And when that is the case, then there is the self-consciousness. There's no other way that we can find the truth of our existence, no other way that we can find the truth of reality and the wonderful beauty of it other than by maintaining this balance in ourselves. Now, the unusual thing about this is that at the same time that the eye of the sun became manifest, it also became obscured by the other two in the form of the moon. And it's like saying that our true self, when we manifest that, it becomes hidden. And it becomes manifest through our deeds indirectly. So that when we have our will attuned to the divine will, our imaginings and our wisdom on one hand, and our actions and sensitivities on the other hand, become the obvious parts of us, so that what is really us, that is with the divine, is obscured by them, and it's another way of saying, by their fruits ye shall know them. And it's a really interesting thing that, it's always difficult. Like Madame Blavatsky, for example, who was a very great spiritual person, believed in hiding her good points and showing her faults. On the other hand, there's the trepidatiousness of showing your good side and hiding your faults. And it doesn't work that way. I think that self should almost always be centered on the one, and that the will should be always focused with the divine will, and then that gets away from that entire problem, and the deeds and the purpose of the deeds stand for themselves. You don't need anything beyond that. Now, it's also interesting that I don't want to get into the cosmology of it, but there is a part in there that it says that for 2 Henty periods in one case, or 2 Hen periods in the other case, which is 120 years, which is a long time. You think in terms of how long you're going to live, 120 years seems a long time. It's more than a lifetime. That the sun was obscured, and it was obscured by bushes. Not only was it obscured by Shu and Tefnut, not only was it obscured by the moon, but it was obscured by bushes. which I think it is clarified in the second version when it says that they were made as adornments and they became impediments. I think that this is the clear statement of the difficulty of the material path. The path of form, the path of knowledge, the path of occultism, where you try to do these things by mentally overpowering everything and by studying all the forms. You can get all tied up in forms and the attainment or control of forms. And that is the problem of illusion. Things that were meant to be the glorious, beautiful, creative expression for the enjoyment of itself and for all of its beings became the things that covered up the spirit of truth. It's a really interesting way of describing illusion. And it also is a very interesting way of solving the problem of illusion. And you know that one group of people would try to eschew matter and say it's evil, let me return to looking at only things of the spirit. But this says that those things which obscured the eye of the spirit, the raw quality, were the things that were meant to be its adornment for enjoyment. Not only Ra's enjoyment, but the enjoyment of every creature. Which means to say that if we do not get hung up in ignorance and try to take things to ourselves and identify ourselves with matter or with forms, but if we see the beauty in matter, that then we see through. Which means it's perfectly all right to eat, sleep, drink, be merry. I'm not talking about alcohol or things like that, which do their own form of obscuring. But all of the things of the earth, we don't have to be afraid of being caught up in illusion if we fulfill the divine intent and see the beauty in everything. Because when we see the beauty in everything, that is what gives us the inroad to penetrate through to the original purpose and intent of it all. And that way you can have your cake and eat it too. It's really interesting. I get all kinds of things when I read through this stuff and I sit there studying away, and more things come. And it's really quite interesting. So basically, it is a story of light over darkness. And the second story especially does exactly what you would expect for the viewpoint that looks from form and matter. It gets very personal about darkness, very personal about matter, and has it laying on its back and has its face cut, which means they were probably into some pretty cruel forms of treatment of people they didn't like in those days. If they scarred their faces. But it is a very dramatic, personal battle with matter, which defeats the whole idea, I believe, of seeing the beauty in it all. All right, there are just one or two little things I want to talk to. When we have the tree of light, we have, in the case of the pout of Hermopolis, or of Kemenu, we have the 8 that form that pout, and out of that, the all-prevalent Ra. If we had the connection with the Absolute, we would have the 10, which would mean that there would be an octave, meaning the same thing on a higher level. Everything starts all over with the principle of octavation. But the Egyptians, because of their hierarchical quality, had this mania about the 9. Now, it's really interesting in this that when there is a chief deity in the upper position that propagates itself all the way through the pout, then the 10th position, the lower octave that would come out of it, is unmentioned. And that is to say, the hierarchy works in such a way that if one focuses in the inner, more spiritual thing, if one focuses on the one, then the elements of the separative, disparate material world become insignificant and become unimportant. And it's clear then that the Egyptians, by staying with the number 9, either had like the 8 pout, and they either had the dominant on the top or they had the dominant on the bottom. And the effect of it was that if the dominance was on the bottom, then the great power was hidden on the top. Whereas if the focus was on the top, then the lower octave. So when the focus is on the top, it's always a spiritual point of view. When the focus is on the bottom, it is a very materialistic point of view, and everything becomes hidden. It's an idea that I wanted to toy with much more, but it would be way too long to go into it in a slow way and develop the ideas. But it's something really interesting to think about. The last thing I want to think about is, since Sans Ra, and including the invisible top of the pout of Hermopolis, these represent 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 states of chaos. But this is 5 states of chaos in a manifesting manner. It's like saying there are, like usually, relative to what we're thinking of now in our stage of evolution, we're at the bottom of all things. We're deeply engrossed in matter. For the most part, we don't even know that the spiritual worlds are there, to say nothing of the chaos that is beyond the spiritual worlds and the holy states that exist there. For us now, the effect of the globes of chaos is to dissolve the things of matter, to bring them into decadence, and to take out the essence of the manifest creative activity. From the creative viewpoint of the Egyptians, it was a matter of drawing on chaos and seeing things dawn out of chaos into a very bright manifest being. And it's an interesting principle that comes out of that. And it goes, I think, something like this: that what we create and how we create it, and how successful or how fulfilled we can be in that whole creative process, depends on the incubatory pre-manifest periods, which aren't always in our waking consciousness as we see it now. But those pre-manifest states are utterly dependent on how we undid what we did before. So the undoing of our previous experience is at least as important as the doing that made it come to be. So that to make something, to create something, even if it's just a conversation or if it's a fellowship among people, is one thing. But all of our future creative success depends on how we undo it, because that is as determinative as in future creations as is the dreaming is to that creation itself. So to just carry something to a state of completion and then drop it would lead to a kind of consciousness that would mean an abrupt type of creation which would lack in all the subtlety and would lack in all the fulfillment of chaotic unfoldment as we see through the pout of Hermopolis. That's probably the deepest principle that we're going to cover tonight, and maybe in the whole business, how we undo. I think of my divorce. How we undo things is determinative of how we are going to pre-do them in the next creative activity. That's the whole principle I wanted to spend most of the night talking on. By then everybody was so tired, including me, that we never did get it right. I promise next time I will try to do less so that we can go into it more thoroughly and enjoy it more. Thank you for sitting through all of that.